Welcome to Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Sumantra Maitra and Joseph Addington, and we have a fantastic show today. We'll be talking about Jeffrey Epstein. The Department of Justice and FBI released a new memo closing the case. So they had different ways they could have played this. They could have done another tranche of kind of nonsense documents that didn't say anything, but they actually closed the case. They said they're not going to release any more information. Epstein wasn't blackmailing any prominent people. He was acting alone. He was just a pervert. You should stop talking about him. That's what President Trump and Pam Bondi were saying in a cabinet meeting this week. I have my doubts about that, as I'm sure we'll discuss. After we talk about Epstein, we'll talk about Benjamin Netanyahu's third visit to the White House. We'll just kind of briefly touch on that, probably, and then talk about Donald Trump's apparent reversal on Ukraine. Last week, we were talking about how the U.S. had halted weapons shipments to Ukraine. This week, it seems like we're going to send those weapons and maybe even additional weapons, including a Patriot battery system for air defense. But first, let's talk about Epstein. Like, I actually have no idea what you guys think about this issue. I'm just going to put my cards on the table and then I'll give it to you to get your take. I'm basically like a full on Jeffrey Epstein conspiracy theorist, and I'm fine using that term. I think Epstein was likely working for an intelligence agency, perhaps multiple ones, Israeli or American or both. I do believe he blackmailed prominent US elites. Until this week, I actually leaned toward the view that he had killed himself. But this prison footage that the FBI and DOJ released, along with the memo purporting to prove that he killed himself, actually makes me more open to the view that he was murdered. And I can talk about why in a bit. And yes, I do think that this new memo is part of a deliberate cover up. At what level of the government, I'm not sure. A lot in it raises eyebrows, as I can talk about later. And as I wrote about in my column today, we're talking on Wednesday. That column is called The Jeffrey Epstein Cover Up Continues. I have, of course, a few caveats. I understand we don't have enough information to paint a complete picture of what was going on with Epstein. That's what's so annoying about the lack of transparency right now with the Trump administration. I recognize that this conspiracy theory is essentially like non falsifiable, and that's never a good thing. And also, the structure of this conspiracy theory is rather unfortunate because every elite who denies that a conspiracy took place becomes under suspicion of being a pedophile. So that's not good for like constructive political debate. Nevertheless, as I said, I do subscribe to the Epstein conspiracy theory, and I'm not going to kind of run away from that phrase. Sumantra, I'd actually be really pleased if you disagreed with me totally and you think this is all nonsense, because then we could have an interesting conversation. But what do you think about this whole Epstein thing and about this new memo?
Yeah, well, I it's complicated. I don't disagree completely. I disagree with some parts of it, but look, as you rightly mentioned, this guy is was essentially a random nobody, right? He suddenly acquired an immense amount of influence, which some way or the other points to some kind of a leg up, as we say in the United Kingdom. Someone helped him to get through the glass door, and then after that, he obviously uh, regardless of how you think, whether you think of him to be a villain or a hero, clearly he had some qualities to, ramp up some of these influence peddling, and then be in the mix, as we say. Um, the guy essentially ran a very upmarket brothel in a way. He was a pimp in some ways. He clearly was peddling some of these things to the extreme high strata of human, Western society. Uh, so much so that he was mixing with former presidents and prince European royalty. So clearly he had, some influence. Uh, Personally, uh, there are a couple of things which tends to be mistaken in policy circles, as you mentioned, like it's something that you cannot falsify, which means like the structure of it like adds on to the suspicion. Like anyone who goes up and demands Epstein, uh, and who is part of the elite is going to be under suspicion. That being said, some of these things happen because high society has a momentum of its own. Once you're in the society, you kind of get to know people, and that kind of automatically propels you towards more and more influence in a way. Epstein clearly used that to his advantage. Whether that was a grand global conspiracy where there's this cabal of people, kind of like an eyes wide shut thing, I don't know. I mean, we're political scientists. We don't really have evidence, and I don't think we are going to get any kind of evidence anytime soon. But that being said, if you are part of that society and you get to move in that circle, it kind of propels you towards a situation where you get to meet people. Like a lot of people always say that, oh, whoever goes to the Ivy League is a left winger, right? But that's not how it is. The thing that happens is a lot of people who actually go to the Ivy League are normal people, they're conservatives. But given the structure of the system, given the peers that you're, working with, you tend to, change your personal conduct and your personal opinions to kind of like care in that society. Epstein is a material ramification of the exact same dynamic. Like, if this guy is peddling influence and women to the extreme upper class society of Western world, then obviously, that kind of pushes him towards more and more and more clientele, and he kind of like gains his influence even further. I actually do tend to believe that he might have killed himself. Again, like I said, I don't have evidence. I'm not in that society. I've got no idea what actually happened. But it makes sense to see that this guy who knew his life is now gone. I mean, regardless of what happens, he's going to be in jail for the rest of his life. He just didn't want to be, and he took a short way out. So I can see him killing himself. Um, but the fact that bothers me about the way this thing was handled was this outright idea that there was no client lease, there was no, nothing, no evidence whatsoever. That I find hard to believe. Clearly this guy was peddling influence. Clearly this guy was, selling women to the upmarket society. Normally it defies logic that someone of his capability and his morals would not have a place where he has written it all down, or where there is some kind of evidence which has the future. I mean, if I am peddling influence to some people, I would like to keep a record of that one, because someday it might come in handy, right? Like, that's just the normal way things are done. So the idea that, I don't know whether Epstein killed himself or someone killed him, but the idea that there was no evidence whatsoever of anyone who has been, peddling influence, or anyone who is part of the client list that he, served, defies logic. That is something which I completely disagree. I'm pretty sure there are evidence, and that is not coming out. Why? Again, open to speculation. The second point, as you mentioned, is the way it was handled. Clearly, it was handled very clumsily. But part of the reason was also, again, this is the same dynamic that happens in reverse. Like, when Trump was running in his campaign, he was throwing out just random, rhetoric, and that was being caught in the influencer circles, and that was being propelled, and kind of like it was gaining its momentum of its own, to the point where, when he was actually, the idea of what could have happened to what actually happened was so vast. The distance between those two realities were so vast. I remember when the first time human bombs were used during the late 1990s and early 2000s, like terrorist attacks, when suicide bombers were being used. There was this huge speculation that RDX, which was a kind of like uh, an explosive, was so small that you can actually carry it in your wallet, which is just not true. But because most of the people have got no idea how these things happen, and they have not seen anything in their life, they kind of, it tends to create this massive gap in reality. I think that's a similar kind of situation happened with Epstein. I think the campaign ran with the idea of overwhelming massive conspiracy of this cabal of people who are doing it, and obviously now the reality is the reality, and they're not being able to say that we were wrong before, so they're just like trying to hush it out, and that was a very clumsy way. uh, One very small point, I actually do feel bad for the woman, I forgot her name, who was the accomplice of Epstein. Uh,
Ghislaine Maxwell?
that's right.
Ghislaine
That's right.
Maxwell, yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know how to pronounce that name, but I actually do feel that she was the one who got the bigger end of the justice system compared to Epstein. I think Epstein was clearly, like, she was clearly under the influence of this guy. Like, this guy was extremely, he's kind of like a cult leader, like a guru. Like, he was very charismatic. I kind of feel bad for her, but again, the long arm of the law and all that. But I
I'll
don't
say I've read a lot about this case, and you should not feel bad about
know.
her at all.
Okay, all right.
Because
I don't know
a
much
lot
about it.
of the women who were abused and girls who were abused say that she was actually worse than him. And she was the finder who would go, get these girls and bring them back to Epstein. She was convicted of sex trafficking, and she was apparently extremely abusive, according at least to the testimony of these young girls.
I think it's my inherent conservatism that whenever I feel that, it's kind of like a damsel in distress kind of thing that hurts you. Like, if you're a man, like, you tend to kind of sympathize with a woman more. Like, I do think like this. I mean, whenever I have read this case and whatever I know about this, like, just whenever I look at the woman, I feel like she was probably under the influence of this extremely charismatic guy. Like, it's kind of like a being with Charles Manson or something. I don't know, but
Yeah, I
clearly,
think you should
more.
realize.
Yeah.
You should relax your chivalry in her particular case. And also, I don't know. I don't think I would agree that Jeffrey Epstein was particularly charismatic. Some people say he was like a math genius. Like journalists will ask his former associates or like this guy who hired him at Bear Stearns when he got his career started in finance, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, he's like a math genius." He doesn't. I haven't seen any evidence that he was particularly smart or charismatic, which makes his wealth all the more kind of confounding and mysterious. Joseph,
So
what do you
is
think
that the
about this
reason you
whole
think
thing?
like he was supported by some kind of intelligence
Well,
agencies? Like, is that
I have multiple reasons for thinking that, and I'll talk about them for sure. But Joseph, what do you think about all this?
Sure. So I admit I'm not really a conspiracy enthusiast guy, so I have a relatively surface level knowledge of the case. I have not done your research, Andrew. Um, but looking into it since it's come up and it is something that's interesting. And reading, for example, the memo that the Justice Department sent out, it's so poorly handled that it actually raises my suspicion that somehow this is like a cry of help done from within the within the intelligence agency, like, we're going to botch this so badly that it can't help but look suspicious or something like that. Because, for example, in the memo it says that Epstein victimized like something close to or over 1,000 different people. um but it also says they found no evidence whatsoever that would lead to any third-party prosecution. Um, this just passes credibility. You know, Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted for sex trafficking. Epstein was indicted for sex trafficking before he killed himself. Were they trafficking all these people just to each other? Uh, then of course there's the strange circumstance of, the Justice Department saying that they had an Epstein client list on the desk when that didn't when now they say, "Oh, actually, that never happened." Uh, they said that, there was no video of Epstein's cell, and now they're saying, "Oh, well, actually, we found video now." Um, but simply, the bare circumstances of the case, simply don't don't add up. You know, the purpose of an investigation is to compile, if Jeffrey Epstein didn't have some central list where he wrote down everybody that he ever trafficked, girls to. Well, the purpose of an investigation is to create that from available records. It doesn't matter if it doesn't exist. That's why the Justice Department goes through and looks at the evidence, is so that they can find those people and compile a list of their own for use in further prosecutions. Uh, that should absolutely be something that's available. Like, we have evidence of who was visiting Epstein, and we have financial transaction evidence that are available for perusal by American intelligence agencies. These are the kind of things that the Justice Department, the FBI, that's their job. That's what they do all the time. And so the idea that we can know that Epstein victimized thousands of people, that we have evidence of massive crimes, that we have all of these tapes of, Kash Patel said it was child pornography, which is why they're not going to release any of it, because they don't want to re victimize. You know, the idea somehow is that all of this, despite the fact that we know Epstein was massively involved in trafficking women and girls to other elites, was not did not involve anybody else who could possibly be prosecuted, is ridiculous and absurd. And so there, in my opinion, there's no doubt that at least this portion of it is a cover-up. The question of motivations, of how Jeffrey Epstein got to where he was, whether he was working with some kind of intelligence agencies, as has been alleged, that's beyond me. There's plenty of circumstantial evidence, but nothing that's convincing, and I don't think we'll ever get anything convincing. Um, but as far as the crimes that have been committed by Epstein, the basic facts of the case that we know do not match up with what the government is doing. And that seems pretty damning.
Yeah, and Sumatra, you asked why I suspect or believe that he was likely working for intelligence agencies. There's a few reasons for this. One is that he boasted that he worked for a Mossad. He boasted that he was a Mossad agent. That's been reported. He might have been, lying essentially, tooting his own horn or something in a weird way. But a former girlfriend of his said that he boasted about that fact, supposed fact, to her, and she believed it. Like she was totally bewildered by him, didn't understand how he got all this money. Um, and so she kind of took him seriously that when he was boasting that he was an agent of Mossad. We also know that, or it's been reported by a very good journalist named Vicky Ward. I think this particular thing comes from the Daily Beast, and some people are questioning how credible of an account this is because Daily Beast isn't the most, credible news outlet in their view. But Vicky Ward is a very serious journalist. She used to be a senior reporter at CNN. She's written for all sorts of outlets. She used to be a writer for Vanity Fair, and she was working on Jeffrey Epstein years before most people were even thinking about this or aware of it. And she says that her boss at Vanity Fair basically squashed her stories and didn't let her report on these sex crimes that she felt like she had uncovered because of intimidation tactics by Epstein and his team. That's her account of the episode, at least. And in the Daily Beast in 2019, she was reporting on Alexander Acosta, who the Trump transition team for Trump's first term was considering for a position of labor secretary, which eventually he got. And one of their concerns was that Alexander Acosta was the U.S. attorney in Florida who cut a sweetheart plea deal with Jeffrey Epstein. He was facing charges of sex trafficking. There were like dozens of girls who had come forward that the police had talked to who they thought they were victims of Jeffrey Epstein. And somehow, instead, Jeffrey Epstein got a charge of as part of the plea deal. It was like soliciting prostitution from a minor, and he served basically no time in jail. I think he had to go to some like fake jail for a few hours a day, but he was able to travel. He apparently victimized more girls during his, went like jail time slash not jail time period. And Alexander Acosta told the Trump's transition officials that the reason he had backed off that case like that is because unnamed authorities, he knew their names, but he didn't reveal them, or at least Vicky Ward didn't, had told him that Epstein belonged to intelligence. And so he should back off. Okay, so that's another piece of evidence, in addition to the fact that Jeffrey Epstein reportedly boasted about being an agent of Mossad. Ghislaine Maxwell, his accomplice, her father had deep ties to multiple intelligence agencies, the Soviets, the British, Americans. He was a Czechoslovakian Jew who escaped the Holocaust and apparently fought very bravely for the British in World War II. And then afterwards, he got deeply involved in all sorts of intelligence related activities with all these ties to these different countries. And he's been referred to as an Israeli super spy. Like people seem quite convinced that he was a Mossad agent himself or asset. He was kind of a one man like storm, sort of an impressive figure in many ways. So this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. I would recommend that people go listen to this recent Tucker Carlson interview with Sagar. What's his last name? Intenji of Breaking Points.
Jetty.
And Jetty, sorry. Yeah, I like him a lot. Sometimes he says things I disagree with, actually, but I watched this interview on Tucker Carlson, and he's fantastic. He knows a lot about this subject. Maybe the last thing I'll say, just because I don't, I teased this earlier, but the reason this prison footage that was released makes me even more suspicious of the circumstances of Epstein's death is that it doesn't show what it seems to show. Everyone's focusing on these two doors on the right side of the frame and thinking, oh, one of those is Epstein's cell. But as best as we can surmise, and the government hasn't given us any like information on how we should interpret this video, but some people have looked at past government documents and like maps of the prison and kind of put together that where we should actually be looking is the common area and this little sliver of a staircase that you can barely see near center frame, slightly center left. Apparently, that's the staircase that leads up to the block where Epstein's cell was actually located. Okay, so you can't actually see the common area fully or that staircase fully. You can't see Epstein's cell at all. The reason we're reliant on this camera is because supposedly the other cameras in the prison either were malfunctioning or only streamed and didn't record video. So we're reliant on this camera that has a terrible vantage point. And I was watching it, and at 10:40 p.m., you can see this like a little before actually. If you want to go watch it, you should start at like 10:39:30, and you'll see p.m. and you'll see this little orange blur traveling up the stairs, presumably a prison jumpsuit, although it's really hard to see. The government says that Epstein was put into his cell at 10:40 at night or thereabouts. So maybe this was him. I don't know. They haven't said, and that's what's so annoying is they've basically squashed the case. And Pam Bondi in the cabinet meeting was asked about this whole thing. She was asked, "Hey, you said that you had Epstein's client list on your desk." She said that in February on Fox News. Now they're saying there is no client list. Okay, I don't doubt that there's no client list. I don't think he kept a little black book called client list. But it's kind of weird. She was clearly overpromising. She said he had lots of help and we're going to release the flight logs. Where is all this stuff? She totally overpromised. She's totally bungled this entire investigation. And when she was asked this question, obviously Trump, as everyone probably saw, he intervened and said, "Why are you talking about this? It's a waste of time. Jeffrey Epstein was a pervert. You're distracting from all the success we've had and from this tragedy in Texas with the flash flooding." And then
That didn't
Bondi
help.
yeah. Bondi then answered the question, and another thing she was asked is this intelligence, aspect of this. Was he an intelligence agent? And she gave the impression of having never even considered this possibility. And it's like, what the heck kind of investigation was this? You don't know where he got his money. Can you look at that? You apparently were unaware that he might be an intelligence asset or agent. That's like the whole thing that this is about. Um, and she said, "I'll get back to you on that. I would say he shouldn't hold his breath." And then she said, "And that's that on Epstein. Like we're done. We're not going to talk about this anymore." This whole thing stinks, as I wrote about in my article today. But I could go on for forever, and I'm not. I'm gonna kind of spare you guys that. But
You should write a
if either of
book.
you, yeah, if either of you have anything else you want to say, I'm all ears on Epstein before we move on.
I've said my piece.
All right. Well, let's move on then to Netanyahu's White House visit. It was his third White House visit. I don't think anyone else, any other world leader, has come here three times. Have any other world leaders even come here twice since in Trump's second term? Not that I can remember. Um, so he came for his third visit. He's still here. Apparently, he's here all week. So they had a big Monday night dinner. Um, that was, on video. You can go watch. They were interacting. Netanyahu uh, announced that he had nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize and let Trump read this letter. They talked about the great success in the war in Iran when in Trump, his bravery in striking Iran. And they talk the ostensible reason for the visit, the main reason, as I understand, is Trump does want to get a 60-day ceasefire during which a permanent ceasefire could be negotiated, and they're working that out. And I think in Qatar, the two parties, Hamas and Israel, and mediators are there trying to work out a ceasefire. Maybe I think Axios just had a report I haven't read that said that there apparently were some signs of progress, but then also Netanyahu said um, we've got to finish the job in Gaza. So he doesn't seem like he's eager to get a ceasefire on this thing. I don't know what else there is to say about this Netanyahu visit, but Sumantra, I'd just be curious. These two things that they're talking about, the Hamas, Gaza war, if you want to call it a war, and then the Iran war and the possibility of future strikes, because apparently Israeli leaders are convinced that Trump, under certain circumstances, would permit them to strike Iran again. And he gave some indication that that could happen if they do, funny stuff with their uranium enrichment or something. So, what do you think about that? What do you think the prospects are for peace in the Middle East in relation to Iran and Gaza and Israel and America?
I mean, to be fair, I think we're all on the same boat. It has been really dispiriting in the last month and a half, for those of us who are America first or realist in foreign policy. It was kind of funny that Netanyahu, of all people, nominated Trump for Nobel Peace Prize. He's the second guy after the Pakistanis, so that's a weird an alignment. I think everyone knows why they're doing it. No one is going to say it out loud. It's one way to get Trump's attention and support. Fair enough. Good. I mean, if they're playing the smart game, so good for them. As to the broader aspect of peace in both Ukraine and the Middle East, look, I have written about this, and you have written about this, and we kind of agree. We probably somewhat disagree on what should be done. Like, I suggest a complete break and like just walking away. I think you prefer a little bit more engagement, but basically on the
Not in
point
the
of
Middle East. But I
not in the
prefer
Middle
more
East, fair,
engagement maybe in Ukraine, but I'm with
right?
you 100% on the Middle East.
Right. But like, I mean, all of us here, and I'm speaking for Joseph as well. Like, we all agree to the causality of the thing that fundamentally nothing is going to change for as long as we are incentivizing their bad behavior. This is not just a Ukraine or Taiwan or Israel question. This is fundamentally, it's something that I wrote about. How many of these states can even be considered to be allies, or how many of these are protectorates? And if they're first of all, these are not like idle naming, right? These help in your analysis. If you know that someone is an ally, you would design your foreign policy based on some kind of shared burden. If you know that someone is a protectorate, you would be like, listen, you do what I say. I'm going to come and protect you if need be, but otherwise, you listen to me. We are in a weird situation where uh, both Ukraine and Israel uh, are extremely, you know, uh, interested and capable of scuttling any kind of peace process that the United States is trying to negotiate with one peer rival and the other like a normal geopolitical rival. I don't consider Iran to be a geopolitical rival, but fair enough. If we even use that nomenclature, we are trying to talk to these people, and then a day before the Istanbul talks, the Ukrainians went and bombed the Russian bomber fleet. A day before, the Iranians were supposed to meet the Americans. The Israelis went on. Part of the reason that they are capable of doing this is because they know that they have kind of like a blank check from us. Regardless of what happens, we are going to support them. As Trump has said himself recently, that Ukrainians are, suffering and we have to help them. But someone should ask Trump the question, but by the way, have you ever considered that you are essentially, rewarding them for destroying your peace process? You were supposed to talk to the Russians. Forget about Ukraine. Forget about your campaign promises of giving them all the money and giving them no money and no weapons at all and just getting out in one day. You can get out in one day. You're just not willing to take the political heat that would come after that. And that is something which I don't think anyone is putting that in Trump's ears. I mean, to be fair, some of our strongest America First people who we have so much faith in, like J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard, and all these people. I mean, I don't know what their influence is now. Like, these are questions that would come to haunt them when they are running in 2028. When J.D. Vance is, for example, running for president as a front runner in 2028, one of the first questions would come is, what was your position? What did you do when we kind of like double down on, and why would we support you? How different you are from the Trump administration? Not the questions that I would ask, but people would ask that. Like, he would face these kind of questions when the time comes. Um, as to the point of the Israelis being confident of a second strike on Iran, why wouldn't they be? I mean, at this point in time, they know that whatever happens, Iran is a husk, a shadow of its former self. All the Iranian proxies which were there, the Iranian grand strategy was based, given the geography of the region, their grand strategy was based on forward positioning of their proxies in the north of Israel, in the east of Israel, and to the south of Israel. Among all of those proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah are relatively, they have declined in power. Hezbollah apparently have directly contravened an order from the Iranians to start a second front. I don't think they've got the manpower or the money to do that. uh, Israelis are waging a war, a campaign of enormous destruction in Gaza. Uh, and the Houthis regardless of their intention, they're fundamentally just not capable of doing much to damage the Israelis. Now, the Iranians, if it was a one on one fight, we could have seen what would have happened, like how much capable they are. But given that the Iranians and the Israelis both know that whatever happens, it would be the Americans who are going to defend from Iranian missiles to the Israelis are more than willing to take that risk. So it's dispiriting. It's frankly frustrating to see that within the first 6 months, some of the easiest places from where we could go get out, we didn't, and we kind of like doubled down in some ways. I do understand that Trump is worried about nuclear proliferation. I think that is something which he genuinely cares about, and to some extent, I agree. I don't believe in the Kenneth Walls idea that every country should have nuclear weapon and there would be peace. That kind of predicates on cultural similarity, which is not there present. Like, I don't want ISIS to have nuclear weapons, for example. Like, I don't trust them to be as rational as the Russians. But for the Iranians, they have been quite rational. I know the Israelis don't believe that, but from an American perspective, you see them constantly telling the Americans that, by the way, this is the time frame from in between we are going to attack your base. That is not an irrational behavior. Like, one of the things that we always talk about is just how different Pakistan and Iran is. Pakistanis, for example, have an extremely secular and no, a westernized elite, but their entire country, like the 70% to 80% of the country, are basically feudal. The Iranians are the exact opposite. They are a theocratic country. Their top, for example, in a Soviet system, their Politburo would be like theocracy, but basically they're not ruled by the theocracy. That's just the top layer. Everyone else from bottom down, like, it's ruled essentially by the Iranian version of the Pentagon. Like, they have this huge secular national security bureaucracy who are the deciding factors. They are rational people. They are, there are families in Iran who, they don't want to go to war and they don't want to have their children and women killed in a conflict. We could have a deal with them, but clearly they really see it in a very different way, and we are going with it, and that is enormously frustrating.
Yeah, I want to come back and talk about this Israel-Ukraine comparison you made about two protectorates who you see as kind of sabotaging Trump's foreign policy or inhibiting his goals. But I'm going to go to Joseph. Joseph, anything to say about the Netanyahu visit to the White House or about Iran, the Gaza ceasefire, the things that Netanyahu was here to talk about with Trump and on Tuesday in an Oval Office meeting with Trump and JD Vance?
Well, I'll be honest, the only thing that I saw that was of note was a meme that somebody posted on social media that says, when you're dating, find someone who looks at you like Trump looks at Bibi. Um, as far as it goes, I don't think this meeting has changed a whole lot in the relationship between the US and Israel, at least since we bombed Iran. Seems like things are just continuing pretty much along the same track. So,
Yeah, that's my impression too, and that's what's got me worried because that track led to a U.S.-Israeli war on Iran not very long ago. So, Sumatra, on this question of protectorates in Ukraine and Israel, I'm curious because I see Israel's strike on Iran, last month, ahead of another round of talks between the U.S. and Iran. I see that differently than I do Ukraine's, you know, drone attack on the Russian fleet of planes, including strategic bombers. You know, for a couple reasons. One, with Israel, I think they were totally obviously sabotaging Trump's diplomacy. He at the eventually he kind of seems to have given them the green light, but I don't think he wanted them to do that. And I think the intention was to preempt a deal, right? But with Ukraine, and this is where you and I disagree, so I'd be curious to hear your response. Ukraine at that time was they had talks scheduled, bilateral talks between Ukraine and Russia, right? Ukraine was getting hammered. That's really what around the time that Russia's drone and missile strikes on Ukraine were escalating. And my read was that Ukraine wanted to kind of change the calculus in terms of leverage to be like, okay, you're hurting us clearly. Like, this is terrible for Ukraine, the attacks that were going on at that time. But we also can hurt you a bit, like to give them an incentive to make a deal because Ukraine has agreed to a ceasefire, the Trump proposed ceasefire. Ukraine says, okay, if Russia agrees, we're definitely going to do it. Full ceasefire in all domains. We'll do it. But Russia hasn't agreed to it. And so I think that was the point of the drone attack, to kind of whether it was ill conceived or not, I think that that was the intention. And also, don't you isn't it your position that the US helped Ukraine carry that attack out and that Ukraine couldn't have done it without our assistance? So I don't really get how it's like sabotage. I'd be curious to hear.
So first of all, I don't know if US helped. I think the thing that I wrote about that strike, and I talked about it before, was Ukraine couldn't have done it alone. That doesn't mean that it was the United States which was helping it. It could be some European countries. It could be Britain, absolutely. I mean, they always have the incentive to have a simmering war in Europe. That maximizes their power because the United States is more tied to Europe, which means Europe is disunited, and that is a fundamental strategy of the United Kingdom. So a couple of things. One, yes, the Russians were escalating on their drones and missile attacks on Ukraine, uh, but that was happening regardless of the talks that was going on. I do agree with you that from our personal experience, and I'm obviously not going to name, and I don't think you're going to name either, but like from whatever track to experiences we have, we were constantly worried that the Russians are miscalculating just how much we are willing to talk to them. I think I understand in some ways why they don't trust the Trump administration, because from their perspective, there is no continuity or permanence in American foreign policy. So regardless of what Trump promises, it might change after 4 years time. So I understand they don't. I mean, they are an authoritarian country, so they don't really see democracies as stable in a way. So I understand why they are they don't trust us. But that being said, they should have understood that there was a genuine interest from Trump's side towards a detente with Russia. I think they miscalculated that. I think they also miscalculated and overestimated their own capabilities. I don't think the Russians are capable as much as they tend to portray they are. They talk about the escalation dominance, and that's partly true. We simply don't have that much amount of interest in Ukraine to die in a nuclear war. But that being said, the United States is extremely capable of ramping up a conflict in Ukraine, which would be enormously damaging for Russian power. They already are in in a pickle of their own, and the Europeans can just sanction the entire Russian foreign currency hold, which, by the way, the United States is the one which is still stopping. The Biden administration stopped the Europeans from pursuing that course of action. So that is something which could be done. Where I disagree with the idea that the Ukrainians essentially reacted to the Russians was in two things. One, the choice of their target was the Russian strategic bomber fleet. Now, strategic bomber fleets are essentially part of the triad. Like, they are the ultimate weapons of deterrence. Russians were not using those bomber fleets to nuke Ukraine. They are
But they
essentially
were
there.
they were using them for conventional warfare. They were
They were
firing
using
missiles
them
at
for
Ukraine.
conventional warfare, but they were also most of the times. So if I was to choose a target, I to make a point, to prove a point that if you can hurt us, we can hurt you too. I wouldn't want to damage something that would essentially make the Russians feel like they're vulnerable to a first strike from the United States. Because that, to me, would jeopardize any chance of a negotiation after that. Like, if the Russians feel that we are essentially using Ukraine to damage their second strike capability, then the Russians are going to be paranoid. And one of the nuclear doctrines of Russia is when their state is threatened, or when they are weaker in a conventional war, and they understand that the state will be threatened, they would escalate to a nuclear threshold. To me, that is an enormously significant point, that we overestimate our own intention. We think that the Russians would think like us, but maybe they won't. Who knows? They might be more paranoid. The second thing, from our perspective, yes, the Ukrainians are facing a Russian attack, and they're fighting bravely, and they're counterattacking the Russians. The Israelis is a little different. They were not facing any kind of direct Iranian attacks, but they were facing, they can feel threatened due to Iranian proxies. My point is simple. It is not our job to tell what the Russians and the Iranians are doing. It is also not our job to tell what the Ukrainians or the Israelis are do or will do. Like, what we can do is we can decide on how much we are going to be involved in this conflict. And from that very narrow perspective, we are in an equal footing. Like, we can decide to support the Ukrainians. We cannot. We can decide to support the Israelis. We cannot. We can just say that, by the way, you have fought bravely. This is your conflict. If you are feeling a hegemonic threat, you know, I'm going to come and help you. Otherwise, you're on your own. In fact, if that is the metrics we are going to use in this question, the Israelis not only just do not face any kind of hegemonic threat in the Middle East, they are the aspirational hegemons. They are the ones who are constantly talking about Greater Israel. They are currently in a conflict in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, in Gaza, and with Iran. You know, that is textbook hegemony. I personally, I can still think, like, if given a choice, I can think that, okay, fine. I mean, understand that Ukrainians can get support from the Europeans. They've got the money and the manpower to help the Ukrainians if they want to do. And if we don't want to go there, fine. But at least Ukrainians are fighting a power which is bigger than them. The Israelis are the biggest power in the region, and we are still going to defend them no matter what happens. To me, there is this kind of disparity in our rhetoric about America first, whereas all we are trying to do is essentially defend protectorates who are, in classical Mearsheimer terms, reckless. It's reckless protectorates dragging us, to an unrealistic course.
Joseph, you had your hand raised when Sumantra was talking about what we can do in relation to Israel and Ukraine is, determine our level of involvement. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, this is somewhat something of a divergence, but I think that one of the things that is really important is having these kinds of discussions right now about potential places this might apply in the future. I'm thinking specifically Taiwan, because this is right now not a huge issue because China is not immediately interested uh, in military action in Taiwan, but it almost certainly will be in the future as China continues to build up its conventional naval and amphibious forces. And we're going to be put face to face with this question about how much we're willing to involve ourselves with an ally that is acting in a somewhat reckless fashion. The Taiwanese are not serious about their own defense. They are not acting in a way that is very conducive to actually defending against potential Chinese aggression. And almost implicitly, the idea is that the US is going to come in and back them up. And so this is something that we should be considering well in advance for when that happens, because that is a much more dangerous and perilous conflict for the ultimate national security of the United States than anything in Israel or in Europe, which cannot actually seriously threaten American security at home, unlike China.
Yeah, I really want to say, and I think this is very important. The media was reporting, I think, a month or two ago that Hegseth, the defense secretary, in a speech had changed our strategic ambiguity policy relative to Taiwan and China. That's the policy where we don't really say whether we would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. It's supposed to deter Taiwan from pushing for independence because they don't know that we'd come back them up. And it's supposed to deter China from invading Taiwan because they think maybe we would come and back up Taiwan. Hegseth did not change that policy. People should go read his speech that he gave. It's a total misreading to say that he changed that policy. He used some tough language, but he essentially reiterated the policy by my reading. And Trump has walked back. Biden basically is the one who changed the strategic ambiguity policy by, I think, on at least three occasions, saying that we would defend Taiwan. And I see Trump as trying to correct that and restore strategic ambiguity. And I think the reporting on that Hegseth speech was just terrible, including by like the Wall Street Journal. I want to transition now. We don't have a lot of time left, but to this topic of Trump seemingly reversing on Ukraine and saying, okay, we are going to let those weapons shipments that were halted go into Ukraine, I think from Poland, where they were already being kept. And also, there's reporting now that he's going to send a new Patriot battery system and interceptors to Ukraine. That's being reported as the first new weapon system that he has approved. But actually, he did redeploy a Israeli-based Patriot system to Ukraine already. Um, so I'm curious, Sumantra, what you think about this. I'm much more open to like arming Ukraine. One reason I see Israel and Ukraine differently is I don't know if the reckless driving, reckless protectorate thing that you were saying applies as neatly to Ukraine as it certainly does to Israel, because I tend to see the history of this as like the US screwed over Ukraine basically by making all of these crazy promises that we were going to bring them into NATO. We were using them to antagonize Russia basically, but without giving Ukraine our protection. So we like basically put them in the worst of all possible worlds where Russia's pissed at them and worried they're going to join NATO, but they're not in NATO, so they're exposed. And but even I at this point am starting to think maybe we should just walk away, as you've put it, for a long time, Sumantra, because just on the basis of like our depleting stockpiles, we used a lot of interceptors to defend Israel and to defend our own base in Qatar during this Iran war, to the point where some reports are saying we have like 25% of the air defense anti-missile missiles that we need to cover all of our like you know anticipated defense needs. That's very worrying because we don't make a lot of these. um, so, Sumatra, what
Make
do you
like
think about Trump's apparent
single
reversal?
digits of THAAD missiles every year.
I think it's
Ridiculous.
24. I think it's 24 annually. At least that was what Greg Priddy reported in the National Interest a couple years ago or a year ago. But Sumatra, what do you think about Trump's apparent reversal?
Yeah, I think it's frankly stupid. I First of all, we cannot mass produce these kind of weapons because these are weapons which needs an enormous amount of expertise and engineering and resources, like the kind of chips that you would require to have a range of harpoons, or a THAAD missile launchers, or a Patriot, or you name it, or a Stingers. They are not like 150 shells, and even that we cannot mass produce anyway. Like, these are not dumb weapons. They are smart weapons, and they need a lot of engineering. Second of all, the United States has, given the structure of unipolarity in the last 25 years, they are obsessed with expensive and massive, weapons platform. That war, I mean, that those days are gone. We are facing adversaries who are producing drones ranging from 600 to 3,000. It's a Go to Amazon, go to look for like a FPV, a first person view drones, and see how much they cost. Add a grenade to that, and see what the total cost is going to be. If we produce like harpoon missiles, or any kind of missiles which are going to cost in millions, to knock down drones, at the end of the day, we are the ones who are going to go broke. I mean, one of the reasons the Germans lost in the Second World War is because they were producing massive, expensive platforms, when essentially the Soviets and the Americans were producing really cheap stuff in Detroit and the Urals. These are things in military strategy which has been true for centuries, and that's not going to change anytime soon. The French were making massive, expensive armors, and the English were using bow and arrow. Like, cheap, weapons are always going to win. The second thing is, look, I eventually, yes, we would have to walk away, because at the end of the day, the strategy of escalation dominance is gonna act in the way that the Russians are gonna be more interested in the region anyway than us. I also do think, but glad that Joseph mentions China. Of all the people, of all the states who would be happy for us to be bogged down in the Middle East and East Europe, guess who will be, guess who are on record saying, yes, we want the Americans to continue, their conflict in Ukraine and Israel? It is China.
Yeah, and I'll say, a lot of people make the claim that helping Ukraine's defense actually, is good for deterring China because it shows China, Western and especially US resolve, that they could expect in the event of their invading Taiwan. And I think that that's not a totally ridiculous thing to think. Like, if China is watching this and changing their understanding in light of events about what they could expect from the West. But what I would say is we've already proved that, right? We already made it really difficult for Russia and Ukraine for years. They probably would have just overridden the country by now, if not for especially US, but also European support. We've already punished Putin. Russia's lost a lot of, soldiers throughout this war. We've punished him for his transgression of international law, and at some point, we have to just stop. Like, And this is also like a total betrayal of MAGA on Trump's part. MAGA, with like the exception of me, was like pretty unified on the Ukraine war. I've been a little bit more in favor of sending weapons to Ukraine, certainly than a lot of people at TAC. Um, but that's not what MAGA wanted Trump to do. This is like his war now. It's not, he can't just blame Biden anymore. And Joseph, I'll pass it to you, but I want to talk about another MAGA betrayal. And I'll tell our audience, if you notice that we're kind of upset with Trump, we're really reflecting the sentiment of MAGA, not the normie voters who, they really trust Trump. They have a very special connection with him, obviously. But among like MAGA, intellectuals or elites or whatever, people are kind of turning on Trump. And I don't know how much it'll matter politically because he does have the base kind of in his pocket, sustainably. He has a very high, probably floor for his approval rating because these people are just not going to turn on him. But the Epstein thing, the Ukraine thing, and also the third thing, his amnesty, they're saying it's not amnesty, it's a work program for farm workers, right? Illegal immigrants. Yeah, that's amnesty by my lights. Like, they're not gonna get sent back even though they broke the law. We're forgiving them of that and letting them stay in our country and work here. We just saw in the LA riots, the significant problems of assimilation that illegal immigration is causing. So this is another thing that people are very angry about. Joseph, what do you think about the Ukraine reversal? And you can also talk about I'd be interested to hear you talk about the amnesty reversal thing.
Sure, I'll keep it really short. First of all, I think the United States has been stuck in this pivot to Asia for forever now, and it's honestly humiliating that we haven't been able to execute something this simple. So that just shows, I think, a very just bad sense, uh, a lack of sense on the part of of the American national security establishment. Um, as far as immigration goes, I think this is a huge deal. And I know that a lot of the people that I talk to are because it's kind of funny if you look at this. The administration has tried several times at this point. They've gone back and forth. They've kind of leaked out. Oh, there's this guest worker program. People got mad about that, and then they retracted it. There were rumors that Brooke Rollins was pushing for amnesty. They said, "Oh no, we're not doing amnesty." Then they can't. Then Trump said, "Oh, actually, we're just trying to watch out for farmers, and we're going to let them vouch for their workers because we want to make sure that because we love farmers, we want to make sure that they're doing all right." Uh, People got mad about that, and so they said, "Don't worry, we're still going to do deportations." And now they're coming out with this work program. Just in the past 2 weeks, they've tried like 5 different times to triangulate some kind of message that they can essentially do amnesty without upsetting the base. Nobody's buying it, and it's just it is very annoying and kind of pathetic to a lot of people who viewed kind of the main component of Trump's domestic policy as border security. Like, we were promised mass deportations. What's going on? Why are it's one thing if you're trying to do mass deportations and you're running into logistical limits. That's natural. But if you're actually going out there and attempting to make some kind of legal carve out, this is just a straight up betrayal of your campaign promises. Um, and this is going to play particularly badly, especially with the amount of money the the legislature has just voted to ostensibly get this priority done for the administration at a pretty great personal cost to many legislators. Like, the one big beautiful bill was not a great bill, but it got passed because it was necessary to get this program through. If we're not going to do that, if we're going to have carve outs for illegal immigrants, what's the point? What are we even doing here?
So I guess that brings us to the end of this episode. I want to remind listeners on podcast apps that you can watch a YouTube version of this, a video version on YouTube. I want to thank people who are watching on YouTube and ask to subscribe, hit the like button, leave a comment, let us know what you think about the episode. We appreciate your support. And I want to thank you, Sumantra, and you, Joseph, for the very illuminating conversation. See you next time.